Hey everyone, thank you for joining me. So today's project is going to be the Spyderco Lil Native. This is the one with the back lock, or I think it's lock back. Now, I know this looks a little blocky, but I don't know if you guys remember, I did a Lil Native for Colin from Devo Knives. If you guys haven't seen that video, I'll leave a link up here in the corner. But this is kind of the leftovers of what I was doing for his knife. These basically were a test run to see if everything worked using my CNC, and everything does work. So I figured, well, I don't want to waste these since everything functions beautifully. Okay, I can wiggle it out for you guys, but you can see everything functions. The lock does sit a little high, but I think I can fix that going further into this build. So my plan is to use the white G10 here and use the original as my guide on that router, that little router setup I have to cut out the shape. So I'm going to do that first. I'm going to use the Mexican blanket, or Especial G-Carta here. I don't know if I want to give it a bolster or use it as, or use the white G10 as a bolster, and then use the G-Carta as the scales in the back. So we'll see how it turns out. We'll see what I decide on. I don't know exactly what I'll be doing yet, but anyways, let's get right into it and let's have some fun with it. I'm going to start off with disassembling the knife since it is currently blocky. So I'm going to leave the hardware installed on one of the white G10 scales. I'll then take the original scale, install it, make sure it's nice and tight, and then I'll trace with a pencil the outline of the original scale onto the underside of the white G10 scale, leaving a nice template for me to work around. And when I take it to the cutting wheel, I know where to cut the bigger chunks off. I'll repeat the same process on the other side. Now here I'm just using my cutoff wheel to remove excess material. That way I don't have to grind as much on the table grinder, and it just makes life a lot easier when taking it to the next step. Now here I'm using the table grinder to get as close as I can to that tracing line, but I'm also leaving just a little bit of extra material outside of that line just in case I slip up or if something happens, but it's always good to leave yourself a little bit of extra room. Here you can see I installed the original scale on top of the white G10 scale, which will allow me to use that original scale as a template against that router bit. This saves a lot of time and just makes things a lot easier. So one thing I do like about this router bit is it leaves just a little bit of extra material that I can kind of finesse with some hand sanding. So I do like that it gives me just that little bit of extra material. Here I'm just using a razor blade to score the underside of the G-Carta. That way when I epoxy it onto the G10, it has something to bite into. Now I'm just taking a straight edge here to mark a line for my bolster area. And I try to match it as best I can on each side, but we'll find out how close we are when I get there. But I'll be using my CNC to create that cut. But first, what I want to do is take a majority of that material out from the back section by manually milling out that material, or a good chunk of the material. That way, when I take it to the CNC, I'm not having to remove as much material with the CNC. It just makes things a lot easier, a lot faster, and really focus on getting that line straight. Now that I'm on the CNC, I make sure everything's nice and flat, and using the grid lines on the bottom board of the CNC to get it as straight as I can. And I also leveled the back section to be the same thickness on both sides of the scales. But the CNC did a beautiful job, and I got them really close to being identical or lined up on each side. So I made a little bit of a mistake. I somehow cut the G-Carta a little too short. As you can see, it's not hanging over the white G10. So my solution was to take a slab of natural canvas micarta material and to wedge it in between the white bolster and the G-Carta. That way it allows me to extend that material. And as you guys can see here, it gives me plenty of extra room to work with. So that was my solution. So I'm going to take that natural canvas micarta material. I'm going to super glue it to the end of the G-Carta. That way it stays in place. So when I do add the epoxy, I'm not battling two pieces. It's just one big piece. Now I'm taking my 5-minute epoxy, mixing it really well. And I'm going to be doing one scale at a time because I don't want to fight time on this. So I can focus on just one side at a time. Generously adding the epoxy. That way I don't have any sections basically without epoxy because I really want this thing to stick well to the white G10. But I ended up doing this to both sides and it's good. Here I'm just going to be using my cutoff wheel to remove those larger chunks of G-Carta. That way I don't have that much material to remove with my belt sander, making life a lot easier, and it just brings everything closer to the white G10. Now using the belt sander, I'm getting as close as I can to the white G10 without touching the white G10. I definitely don't want to do that because then I'll be in trouble, but you can see I got as close as I can. Now what I'll be doing is taking a milling bit and bringing down that material that I just epoxied onto the G10 to the same level as the G10. That way, when I hand sand it, I'm not having to remove as much material by hand. Again, it just makes things a lot easier. Since I epoxied the G-Carta onto the G10, I now have to redo the hardware holes. So I'm just drilling out the hardware holes for the backspacer. And then after I get those drilled through, I will then countersink those hardware holes and give them the right depth for the hardware to actually go down deep enough to thread into the backspacer. As you can see here, it's not that deep, but I ended up going a little bit deeper. That way it actually has something to bite into on that backspacer. Now I'm going to repeat the same process I did earlier for the white G10. Now there is a little bit of that G-Carta sticking out side of the white G10. So the router bit is just cleaning it up, making it really, really nice. And again, I will be hand sanding these scales to be nice and flush and just the right size on each side. Here I'm just taking some 120 grit and a flat piece of aluminum to get the edges of the scales nice and straight, clean and flat. That way they're identical. And I'm doing this all the way around the knife. That way it just looks really good. And as you can see, very, very nice and clean and straight. I'm now taking a titanium pocket clip that I found off of a broken knife, which I think is just the right size for this build. But I marked the holes, making sure I want that pocket clip exactly where I want. But I'm drilling through only one hole. That way I can take a screw, go through the pocket clip, thread it in, or just screw it in, and making sure that pocket clip is exactly where I want it to be. And then I'm actually going to drill through that second hole. That way I know the hardware is going to be exactly where I want it to be. And it's going to line up exactly the way I want. Now I'm going to take it to the CNC and create a little pocket underneath the underside of the scale because I'm making room for some brass. This is 16th inch brass. And I'm going to make a little custom piece that fits in there. Now, I like to use brass because it's easy to shape, and steel's a lot of work, especially to make something exactly that size. So I'm super gluing in that little brass piece that I made. That way, once it's in there and I get it in there nice and snug, as you can see, I'm really forcing it down there. After that is in there, I can drill the holes all the way through with the tapping drill bit that comes with the tapping kit. I forgot the tapping size, but I'll put it up on screen of what I'm using. And that tap is very, very common for a lot of pocket knives, so that's why I have a few of them. But I'm taking my drill gun, and I'm just slowly going to tap through that brass and make sure I get at least 4 threads. I think that's plenty strong to hold hardware in, but really happy with it, and it does function. Now here I'm taking a straight edge and marking my beveled areas. And I decided to get a little creative here and just put some unique beveled sections just to make it a little more unique and more comfortable in hand. But now I'm going to take my Dremel and remove a majority of the material, but I'm going to stay behind my marked lines because I don't want to go past that. I still want to use those lines as a guide when I manually sand these down. But you can see here, it got a nice rough cut everywhere, and I still have my lines. So after this process, I take it to the clamp, or the vise, sorry, and I'm going to clamp it in, and I'm just going to take some 320 grit and just really fine tune those beveled edges and get them exactly where I want, and make sure that they are even on each side, that they match, and just visually looks good. Now this is where you really want to take your time and make it basically to where you're satisfied. So I am happy with what I was able to do here. I cleaned it up with some lacquer thinner, which I like to use that because if you do miss a spot with the 320 grit, it will show up if you miss any deep scratches. Here we are back up in the studio. And before I assemble this knife, I just want to talk a little bit about what I did to this knife. And we're going to start off with the scales. So as you guys saw in the beginning of the video, I used a set of white G10 scales that I made a couple months back. I just didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with them until this build. So one of the most challenging parts of this thing was to cut with my CNC these sections right here to create the white G10 bolsters, and I was struggling to get them lined up, but I just really took my time, and as you guys can see, they line up perfectly, and same on the bottom. So again, that is one thing that I was fighting, but I got that just exactly the way I wanted. And as you guys saw, I epoxied the Mexican blanket material onto the section that I cut out, which I did that because I wanted some strength from the white G10, and I think it also looks cool. And as that saying goes, measure twice, cut once. I should have listened to that a little bit more carefully. But the reason I have this brown strip of natural canvas micarta in here was to fix the issue of me, I don't know how it happened because I could have swore I cut it just right, but it wasn't enough width to cover the section. It was actually on the inside of this white G10, so I had to extend it out. So my solution was to add that natural canvas micarta, which I think looks really good. It definitely complements it, and the weave pattern of the fabric matches the Mexican blanket as well. And one last thing I had to do was add my logo with the CNC underneath, just to put my signature on this thing. Now, the fun part of this build was creating the pivot collars. I used the CNC to create these larger sections for the pivot collars to fit in, which I think turned out really great. I created 2 sets. Another thing I did to the scales where I added some beveled sections, different styles, I guess, in different parts of the knife. Not only for looks, but to actually feel a lot better in hand. So overall, really pleased with the scales. And I did use a extra pocket clip. This is titanium. I forgot which knife that I got this off of. I know it was a broken knife. It's black. I stonewashed it a little bit more aggressively to match the etched and stonewashed blade. As you guys can see, I placed this pocket clip to be just behind that white bolster, so it doesn't distract from that really sharp line between the white G10 and the micarta. And oddly enough, this This pocket clip is the perfect size. As you guys saw in the video, I like to use brass as kind of a anchoring point for custom pocket clips, just because it's easy to shape, very easy to thread, and it's strong enough to hold screws as long as you don't really crank down on that screw. But that was my solution around it, and it works really, really well. And we're going to move on to the pivot collars, which again, I've created 2 sets. Now I created some from the Mexican blanket because I had enough lying around. And as you guys can see, I created kind of an offset so each side is a little bit different, complementing a different section of the material. So one has more of the orangey red and yellows, and then the other one has more of the blues. So really happy with those, and we'll discuss a little bit later which ones look better because I don't know. But I'm leaning more towards the natural canvas micarta pivot collars, just because it really complements that little strip of the brown or the natural canvas micarta on the scale. But I'm going to install these on first, and then we'll see which ones look better, or you guys will let me know which one's better. And then I etched and stone washed the blade, the backspacer, and the lock bar, but I gave it a scalloped texture. Now I do like it when it's shiny, but my goal was to etch and stone wash this blade just because I wanted contrast against the white. And again, more on that when I assemble it. But gave it a fresh edge and gave it actually a deep sharpening choil. Aggressive sharpening edge just because I like my sharpened edges to kind of bite a little bit. I gave the hardware a satin finish just to kind of match some of the shinier parts on this build, which are not only the hardware, the rest of the hardware, but I did put a satin finish on the inside of the Spidey hole. So really, really happy with that. Just a lot of cool contrast going on, and to also complement the white G10. But I think that's pretty much it. Enough talking about it. Let's put it together and see what it looks like. And here it is all assembled, which I'm really, really happy with how this thing turned out. Again, those pivot collars really complementing that one thin strip of the micarta. Here's the show side. Then I'll show you guys the pocket clip side. And again, got very lucky with the size of this pocket clip because I think it fits perfectly. Here is the scallop texture that I created on the spine of the backspacer, the lock bar, and of course the spine of the blade. So it just has a nice continuous flow of that pattern. Since the lock bar moves, it is slightly higher than the backspacer and the spine of the blade. That's something I really couldn't prevent. I wanted a nice tight fit up, but I think it'll settle once it breaks in. I did want to mention that I added that texture on the front finger choil on the bottom section. As always, let me know down below what you guys think, how this thing turned out. Really quick, I'll put up a video of the Mexican blanket pivot collars, just so you guys can see what it looks like. And again, let me know down below if you guys prefer the natural canvas or the Mexican blanket G-Carta ones. I am happy with how the G-Carta pivot collars turned out. I think it complements it very well. But again, let me know down below which one you guys like more. But I myself am definitely leaning more towards the natural canvas micarta ones. Now this knife was really smooth before I even customized it. So, I mean, it's going to come back. As you guys can see, it's already dropping shut. But you can Spidey flick it, no problem. And thumb flicking works just as good. I mean, this thing is rock solid. Again, you do have the lock back version. Very similar to a cold steel. So, not even really surprised that it is a strong lockup. But really, really love the size of this thing. And ergos are really, really good on this thing, since you do have that very, very generous front finger choil, which makes it a full grip in my hand. I have medium-sized hands, so I think even people with large hands can comfortably use this knife. But as I mentioned before, I did add those extra beveled sections, again making this even more comfortable in hand. There's no hot spots. I made sure to put the pocket clip in a good placement to where it eliminates any hot spot. And every time I customize a knife, that's kind of my main goal, is to make it comfortable, especially with a pocket clip. If the pocket clip sucks or it's in a crappy position, I like to place it to where it actually makes sense, or just completely create a new custom clip. And before I end the video, just want to mention that today's carry was the Padre from Kunwu Knives. Really, really love this thing. I did customize this, and if you guys haven't seen that video, I'll leave a link up here in the corner. You guys can check that out. Feel free to let me know down below what you guys are carrying today. I'm always curious to see what people are carrying. But there it is, the fully custom Spyderco Lil Native. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys on the next one.